Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. Today on the program, we have Jonah Pickle, who is a student at the University of Lethbridge. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Jonah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Anyway, I just wanted to give your bio here for people's interest. So you were born and raised in Calgary, but you are
Mhm.
now a fourth year Bachelor of Science degree. You're pursuing a Bachelor of Science degree in neuroscience at the University
Mhm.
of Lethbridge. During this time, you were in student government at the University of Lethbridge, and at this time, you became aware and developed an interest in the effects of wokeism on the academy. And you believe that the culture we're seeing on campuses today, in large part, is due to wokeism, and this poses a threat to the fundamental principles of the university. And you would like it if we were to conserve the value of these institutions, the acceptance and integration of these ideas into the university pedagogy. You must resist the wokest uh, integration of wokest ideas into pedagogy. So that's what was said about you at the Lethbridge Public Library event.
Mhm.
So that's kind of a bit of a background. And for people who have not watched this program before, the format is for me to ask Jonah questions for an hour. And then after the hour, Jonah can take over and can ask me questions for an hour. And that's just to make sure we don't leave anything out. And as well, sometimes there's a bit of a bias that creeps into the interviews of people, and that's to prevent that from happening and to give fairness in the process. Before we get into some of these details about your background and what's been happening, uh,
Mhm.
maybe you can just fill the audience in a little bit, just with some more details if you'd like to.
I think you covered most of it. Um,
Okay.
I am a fourth year neuroscience student. I've decided to minor in philosophy. That emerged as an interest of mine as I moved through my university career. And that's also how I got to know Dr. Viminitz, who's our connection to each other.
Yes.
Um, I'm not sure what else there is.
Okay. Um, so University of Lethbridge.
Mhm.
When did you start at the University of Lethbridge?
2020.
In 2020.
Yep.
And has there been a change at the University of Lethbridge, or have you found that it's been pretty consistent?
I think it's been pretty consistent. I wasn't aware of campus culture at all my first year because that was during COVID. So it was entirely online. I stayed in Calgary the whole time.
Okay.
But once I gained an awareness of campus politics and culture and all that, I think things are pretty stable.
And when did you join up with the Students Association?
That would have been my third year. So last year was my first year.
2023? 2023?
Yes. 2022, 2023. Yeah.
Okay. So, what kinds of things have you been, before we get into some of the more controversial kinds of things that have been going on,
Hmm.
perhaps we should just look a little bit at your neuroscience experience. So neuroscience and philosophy, that's a
Hmm.
very interesting combination. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Sam Harris.
Yes, I am.
I think that's kind of what he's done, right? Or is it, I think it's neuroscience and philosophy were his
I think you're right.
two kind of interests as well.
Hmm.
Are you someone who appreciates Sam Harris, or are you someone who is a critic of Sam Harris?
I haven't listened to him enough to have an opinion. I
Yeah,
all I know about him is he's a neuroscientist. I believe he's an atheist. I think he's done some debates with Jordan Peterson. I might have listened to those a few years ago, but I don't particularly remember his position.
he's quite an interesting figure because I guess I would even characterize myself as a fan of his.
Okay.
Um, and then like now I still do appreciate a lot of what he does, but he's
Hmm.
become quite controversial in the anti woke kind of circles because he it's claimed, and I have to, I'm not gonna, I haven't really investigated this all that much, but it's claimed that he kind of developed a bit of an authoritarian kind of uh, you
Mm.
know trajectory because of Donald Trump. So he's very much of a crit, like not that many people are critics of Donald Trump, but he thinks that Donald Trump is such an existential threat to the world that it is legitimate to shut down speech of
Hmm.
Donald Trump. So that was kind of that's kind of where he's gone, at least, and maybe that's being a bit unfair, but I thought it was kind
Mhm.
of interesting because people used to be fans of Sam Harris are now often like they see him as as someone who's gone over to the dark side of kind of authoritarian kind of politics. But anyway, so tell me about your neuroscience experience and what you're sort of taking and what kinds of things you're looking at.
My neuroscience experience, it's been very good. I think lots of what's going on with politics on campus, it hasn't infected the sciences yet as badly as it's infected the humanities or the social sciences. So it's all been good. I got to study neuropsychology, neuroanatomy, things like that, neurobiology. It's been a positive experience, but it's not the field that I want to work in, and I've learned that as I've studied it.
And why is it that you don't want to work in that field?
I can't imagine myself enjoying a career in a lab. I don't think that's what I want to do.
Mm, yes.
But out of high school, I had a different idea. When I
Mm.
graduated high school, I thought neuroscience is exactly what I want to do. I want to get into research or maybe try to get into medicine, but that's it's changed.
What about philosophy? What's your views on like going more into philosophy, philosophical kinds of areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's probably my greatest interest in academics right now is in philosophy and literature a little bit, but I just haven't read enough to, I don't know, say that fairly. Um, but yeah, that was something that I wasn't interested in at all in high school. I wasn't very into reading. I didn't know how to write whatsoever. And I learned those things kind of my first couple of years of university. And then I took intro to philosophy. And I was, wow, this is really interesting. That stuff clicked with me a lot more than the neuroscience did.
Okay. And when did you meet Paul Viminitz?
That's a funny story. So I came across news of him before I'd ever met him. I read an article where I believe he used the N word in one of his classes, and it was in context. He wasn't calling a student that word. He was talking
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah,
slavery
yeah,
and the
yeah, yeah.
whatever. And so I read that article about him, and I thought like that's strange. I was taking philosophy of language at the time, and so I was learning about the use mention distinction, and I was
Mm,
like, it seems strange that administration would say that his mentioning of that term harmed students. And so since I was on the students union already, I organized a meeting with the dean. And I just wanted to talk to him about it because I was like, this seemed to me like there might be a slippery slope there if you start labeling the mentioning of words as
yes,
harmful and then
yes.
use that to justify punishing professors. And so I had that meeting. Nothing really came of it. Kind of just discussed that concept with the dean and then left. But then after that, I found Paul's blog, I believe, and then I reached out to him because for a long time before I met Paul, I was trying to find a professor at the university that was concerned about what was going on, the issues that we would describe as woke issues.
Yes.
And not very many professors wanted to talk about it. I tried to strike up conversations and they just wanted to stay away from me. It's like, I don't get involved in that. I don't have an opinion on that. I just focus on my specialty and leave that alone. But Paul seemed to have an interest in it, and he seemed to share my concerns. And so I reached out to him, and him and his wife invited me over for dinner, and we've been
Yes.
friends since.
Yes. Yes. That's the first time that we met was, and I remember it very clearly at one of Paul's famous Guess Who's Coming for Dinner episodes, which I've been to two. Have you been to any? Have you been to any other Who's Coming for Dinner
No,
episode?
you were the first.
Yes, no, there's been I don't I think because of COVID things got sort of slowed down there. to some extent, but I'm not sure if there's been one since Albert and I were there in, I guess that was in the end of January, because that was right before
Mm-hmm.
the famous episode happened. And what courses have you taken with Paul?
I've only ever taken one with him. Last semester was my first. I took game theory with him, and I was going to take philosophy of war with him this semester, but the school had other plans.
Okay, well, tell me what you know about that situation. So, for people who are not aware of this, there is a separate interview that I did with Paul, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago now, on the fact that he was fired at the beginning of this term, which is a long, complicated story. But anyway, I just want to get your, like, tell us what your, before I prejudice you in any way, what's your understanding of the situation?
From what I understand, there was something like 11 complaints filed against him anonymously, and I think those were mostly filed during the period of time when he tried to bring you to the school. And they tried to summon him to disciplinary meetings, and he refused because the principles of natural justice weren't being followed. They wouldn't tell him who the accusers were, and they wouldn't tell him the time and place that the incidents happened. And so he refused to get involved. He told his union not to get involved either. The school found, or two more complainants came forward that were willing to have their names be public.
Yep.
And all of this, it started an investigation. They hired somebody externally to investigate. That person presented their findings to the provost, and the provost ultimately made the decision to terminate Paul.
Okay. Do you know who the professor is?
I don't know.
Okay, I'm still trying to find that out.
Mm-hmm.
Paul
Yeah, I
didn't
don't.
bother to look at that, which I thought was quite interesting. That he's just really lost all interest in any of this kind of stuff. But this is a hugely important situation, which
Mm-hmm.
anyone who's concerned about academic freedom should be concerned about. Anyway, so were you one of the people who did you go to the dean to discuss this with?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you met with Dean Letts, is that correct?
No, it was the provost. So
With the provost.
Michelle Helstein, I
Okay,
believe. Mm-hmm.
and what happened there?
We were referred to the collective agreement. That's pretty much it. She couldn't answer very many of our questions because everything about the case is confidential. And yeah, all that we were told is that he was found not to be, I don't know, he was failing to meet the responsibilities of a professor outlined in the collective agreement, and that gave the university grounds to terminate him.
Yes. Anyway, this is anyway, we're so as far as I understand it, where we're at now with this
Mm-hmm.
is that we're still waiting for the emails for Paul to get the emails.
Yeah, I believe he lost access to everything that was attached to his university account.
Yes, which is what they do. And people who are concerned about these matters, anyone who is concerned about their current position at a university should be very aware of the nature of university servers. And
Mm-hmm.
anything that you want to keep hold of, you should put in another private email or on another computer and so on. Because once you lose that, you can't get it back. Um, so yeah, so that's all ongoing, and we still don't know. We have to wait. The biggest, uh, most important document that we do not have right now is the investigator's report.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
was that given to Paul?
well, he claims that it was sent to him.
Okay.
So, but it's on the university's email service, which is sort of surprise. Like this is the often the biggest battle that goes on is getting these reports,
Hmm.
and often they really want to make sure that you don't you don't talk about it and so on and do a bunch of machinations to keep things under wraps. So it's interesting that they just sent it to Paul because in my case I had to I had to file freedom of information requests to get the reports, and then they were redacted when I got them. So it'll be
Oh.
interesting to see if the report that Paul was sent, uh, if it was sent, right? Because it might have just been a summary or something like that.
Hmm.
There's a difference between a report and a summary of a report. So, if that report was sent, is it redacted? Does it have redactions in it? Like these kinds of
Hmm.
questions, which is still unknown. But I'll be very interested. We're waiting, but we're very kind of like anxious to receive this report because we can't
Hmm.
really until we get the report. It's hard to really kind of understand, except for what Paul has said about it. Understand what's going on.
And he hasn't said much. He doesn't seem to be too bothered by it.
He's not bothered by it. Like that's kind of Paul is
Hmm.
sort of saying I've been here, I've had a good career, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life enmeshed in this situation. Which I guess I sort of understand in some sense, but um, it seems to me to be a little bit cavalier about it. If not for his own name and reputation, uh,
Hmm.
but for like, there's a whole bunch of people behind him who are suffering from these kinds of things, and his case is a way to shed some light on the matter. So that's
Hmm.
very, very important to get this report. And if I had known that I had no idea until he announced that he'd been fired that this was even going on. Um, yeah. So student politics. So tell
Hmm.
me about your student government experience.
It's it's been good for the most part. I've enjoyed the experience, and it's kind of opened my eyes to things that I like and things that I dislike. It's definitely improved my ability to communicate and to get along with people who I disagree with, but to still have discussions about ideas. Um, in terms of the political leaning of our student union, it does lean to the left, but I don't think it's as bad as many other students' unions in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of expected Lethbridge, Alberta. It's a fairly conservative place, but
Mm-hmm.
still, there's a big focus on EDI and indigenization and all of those terms.
Okay. And
Mhm.
why do you say it is left leaning?
Um, the conversations that I've had with many of the people on the students' union, you can tell. You ask them their position on a particular issue. For the most part, it leans to the left. Um, and I might be wrong about this, but I would tend to classify proponents of EDI and indigenization typically as progressive. Maybe not economic leftists, but progressive.
Yeah, because this is a big issue as to
Hmm.
left. What is the meaning of left, and whether um, EDI is actually left wing or is more of a corporate strategy.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I just gave a talk in Alberta, University of Alberta, about this matter. What's called corporatization of the university,
Hmm.
and EDI is part of the corporate branding exercise of the university, selling EDI to various constituencies and so on. So you've been on the student, are you still on the student union?
Yes, I am.
And you've been on there for a
This will
year,
be my second year.
second year?
Yeah.
And what position do
I'm
you
an arts and science representative. So our students union, we have, I believe it's 5 executives. And for them, the position is a full-time job. I think they get paid for 40 hours a week. They all put in more than that. But for us who aren't executives, we're on what's called the General Assembly. And technically only 10 hours per month is required of us. They pay us an honorarium.
okay. And what are your duties in that position? In that position?
We are appointed onto committees. So there's internal like student union committees, and then there's external school committees. So last year I sat on General Faculties Council. This year I'm on Arts and Science Council, Arts and Science Executive, things like that. For the
And
most part.
do you have a voting a role
Yeah.
do you have a vote?
Yeah.
And how many representatives are there on? Do you know what the size of the arts and science faculty council is?
The size of the Arts and Science Faculty Council.
Yeah, how many members?
If I had to guess, 60 maybe.
Okay. And how many students sit
I
on that?
believe It's all of the arts and science representatives, and if I had to guess, it would be all of the executives. And so there's six of us from the arts and science faculty and five executives, so 11 student votes.
Out of 60.
It might, yeah. I don't know the numbers.
Like
I
that
would have to check.
approximately? Because this is
60
going to be
sounds
big
about
press.
right.
Do you think this is a good, do you think this is beneficial to the university to have this kind of student representation?
We're such a minority that it doesn't really matter how the students vote. If the school wants to move forward with something, they're going to move forward with it regardless of what we say or how we vote. Um, I still think it is important. We can share concerns that students have and our opinions on things, even though they're not necessarily taken into consideration. I think the school does sometimes. They hear us out. In my experience, the administration they've been good.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, we've had a few episodes at various universities, and you mentioned in your bio about wokeism, the role that wokeism is playing in the institution. I was wondering if you could just tell the audience what you sort of mean by that and what you've been seeing with respect to wokeism's influence.
Mm-hmm. I think the most significant way that it's influencing the universities is in terms of their commitment to academic freedom. I think that as a priority has lessened in universities, and their focus on safety and protecting students, not physically, but intellectually, from dangerous hate speech and from ideas which are harmful. That's became a higher priority for universities than academic freedom. And that's obviously debatable, but when it comes down to it, and universities are pushed to make a decision, it seems, at least at the University of Lethbridge, that they removed you from campus. They've let go of Paul now. So when push comes to shove, they prioritize the reduction of psychological harm over their commitment to academic freedom. And I think that that is a mistake that the universities are making.
Yes. Um, and why, so wokeism, like, how would you characterize wokeism? Like, what is your definition of wokeism?
Good question. Um, there was a definition that somebody else put forward. Forget exactly what it said, but it was something along the lines of adoption of a particular ideology, but through the use of force. And I think that's fairly accurate. Is that there are forceful methods of coercion that people or the managerial class, whatever you want to call it, are employing, that they force you to adopt their positions on particular issues. And so under the umbrella of wokeism, I would say things like EDI fall under there, anti-racism, microaggressions, indigenization.
And how do they force you to adopt those positions?
Well, for some of us, the training is mandatory. So we all had to undergo mandatory sexual violence training at the school.
Mm.
And I think I talked about that at the library, but
Yes.
it wasn't practical advice. They didn't say things like, you're more likely to be assaulted if you're drinking. So be safe, buddy up, cover your drinks, don't leave your things alone if you go to the bathroom. And it's like sexual violence is an intersectional issue. It's the fault of white men and colonialism. So it's clearly ideologically tinted. And for us students, that was one instance in which it was forced because we couldn't enroll in classes unless we completed that training. For me on the Students Union, there's 4 more training sessions like that are required of me.
And what were the training? So all students have to take the uh, sexual violence, the
Mm-hmm.
anti-sexual violence training. So that's all students. Any other trainings that they have to do besides that one?
No, not for all students.
Okay. And then for if you're going to be on the Students Association,
Mm-hmm.
then you've got to take additional training.
Yeah, so I think there was like an Indigenous awareness training. We did one on microaggressions last year. That might have been the anti-racism training. There's a level 2 to sexual violence that they tried to require us to do, but I went through the bylaws and I put up a fight, and so I got exempt from that because it didn't seem like we were technically required. There's one more, but I'm blanking on it.
And so is this on the computer? So I assume you do this through your on the computer?
The sexual violence training that's mandatory for all students, that is on your computer. It's through the same program, Moodle, which our classes are run through. But the other ones that I was required to do because of my position on the students union, those were in person. The
Okay.
one that's taken place so far has been in person.
And who runs them?
The one that we did last year, which was, it might have been anti-racism. There was a big focus on microaggressions. I forget what they titled it, but that was ran by our school's now vice provost of EDI.
Martha.
Yes.
Yes. Martha looms large
Mm-hmm.
in the February 1st clown show, what I will call the clown show,
Mm-hmm.
which yeah, no, this EDI provost of EDI seems to be uh, a large part of this kind of imposition of this kind of woke kind of element in the university.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Microaggressions. So what happened there? Like this is an interest of mine actually. This
Mm-hmm.
microaggressions. What are microaggressions? How do we know if something's a microaggression or not? Do you know what? Do you have any sense of that?
To me, it sounds like it's up to the victim's interpretation, whether or not what you said was just a harmless comment or even a compliment, or if they interpret it as a microaggression. I know that during that training, she used the analogy of a mosquito bite. So if I comment on your hair every day, I might think I'm being kind, but if this is 20 different people are doing it to you every day, then they stop feeling like compliments and they start feeling like mosquito bites.
But if it's just one, it could be if it's just one, it's a compliment, or if it's
I
or
don't
is that no one like or is it just the fact that some people like their hair being complimented about and other people don't?
know. Mm-hmm.
This is not a problem seen as a problem in the micro.
I think it's a problem because I have no idea how you define what is a microaggression versus what isn't.
Yes. Um, that's just kind of an interesting area because I was involved in a tangle about microaggressions because we used to have workshops. We had workshops, professors did,
Mm-hmm.
on microaggressions, which were not mandatory. So I don't know. I'm sure they're moving in this direction, but when I was in the thick of things, there would be these workshops held, and I would go to these workshops as a somewhat skeptical person about these matters.
Curious. Like I
Yeah,
was curious when I went. I was
and as
maybe
well,
there's
like
validity.
concepts, like
Mm-hmm.
is this something that is of use to us, or is it got problems? And if it does have problems, what are the problems? Anyway, I had a situation that I was not personally involved in, but I heard about this situation
Mm-hmm.
where, and it's kind of interesting you brought up the hair because it did have to do with a compliment about hair. Uh, a student was about to give a presentation and she had dressed up for the presentation uh,
Mm-hmm.
and looked more formal than she usually did. Anyway, a friend of hers said, "Nice haircut" to her. That's
Mm-hmm.
nice haircut. And she wasn't upset about this at all. But a third party listening to this thought this was
Mm-hmm.
offensive and went to the chair of the department. And this student was one of the charges against him for a code of conduct violation, and he had to go through the code of conduct office because of this. And when I heard about this, I was incensed because I don't think that's the sort of thing that we should be having the code of conduct office about. And I was always bothered by this. And in this workshop, I brought up this example about the two different interpretations of this event and
Mm-hmm.
how do we distinguish between, like, if one person thinks it's a microaggression and the another person doesn't, how do we determine? And in this case, it was the person who was having the compliment uh, provided to her who was okay. It was a third party who was upset about it. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
um, the person who was doing the workshop said, "That's a very good question." In
Mm-hmm.
response to what I was saying, but it didn't end there, that story, because me asking that question in the microaggressions workshop was seen as a highly offensive thing for me to be asking that question in the
Mm-hmm.
workshop. So that could even be my asking a question about what the nature of microaggressions are, could in fact be considered to be a microaggression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've faced that response a few times when I'm asking things that I think it's a legitimate question. And
Yes.
then instead of being answered, I'm told that I'm doing something wrong by asking. So
Yes.
it's a interesting defense mechanism, and it leads me to believe that they probably don't have a good answer to what I'm asking. Because if they did, then why not tell me? Why start with ad hominem attacks, accuse you of microaggressing? Why do that if there's a fair answer to that question? I think there isn't a good answer to your question about who decides if this is a microaggression or not. Like in that case, it sounds like the victim didn't, they weren't offended, they didn't believe that they'd endured any harm, but a
Yeah.
third party, a witness, did.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sound like there was intention on the part of the perpetrator.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any objective measure here, which is,
Mm-hmm.
I think this is, and my own view of wokeism is that it sort of relies on this, the prizing of subjectivity over objectivity. Like that's the nature of postmodernism. That's the
Mm-hmm.
foundation of it. And then we get into that members of certain groups, because of their position in society, their response is something that should be taken more seriously than other people's responses. So that's, I think, a little bit. Did you ever get a sense of that with microaggressions, that whether, depending upon your quote unquote positionality, which is the
Mm-hmm.
extent to which you're perceived to be oppressed, is it, as a microaggression, more likely to be a microaggression depending upon your positionality? Did they say
I would
that?
assume so, yes. I think if somebody complimented my hair and I went to the code of conduct office and told them that I'd been microaggressed, they would just shoo me away. So I assume that you're right.
I don't know. I and I'm nervous now because of what you said about the questions. Like
Mm-hmm.
this puts everyone in a terrible situation,
Mm-hmm.
because you feel that just to even ask a question to try to get clarification is itself evidence of some kind of ill intent, and that you're kind of got, you're trying to keep people down and in an oppressed state or something like that. So there really seems to be a bit of an expectation of just going along with whatever's being
Oh,
demanded. Like,
absolutely. And I think whether intentional or not, that's turned out to be a wonderful strategy for the EDI type people. Because once you slap the label of EDI on an issue, it is off the limits for criticism. Like some of the things that were passed in GFC last year. Like I couldn't believe it. Like it didn't make sense to me. And I'm in a room of professors, all of whom have PhDs, so I assume they're pretty well educated. They can think about an issue quickly, and if something's not adding up, they're aware. But if the proposal or whatever it was put forward under the guise of EDI, they just didn't ask those questions.
yeah, well, you have a, and I have sensed this for quite some time, and I just go and ask the question anyway. But you feel pressure, like you definitely feel, that this is not a welcome, it's not going to be a
Mm-hmm.
welcome question. Like everyone is acting as if this is just self-evident,
Yeah.
and if you are taking issue with it, you're either sort of thick, like you just, you're not very intelligent, or you've got some kind of moral failing that would make you not able to see this and so on. Right?
Yeah.
This is
I,
kind of this sort of, and it's unspoken. It's understood somehow. And it's an interesting question. How does this get? How do you think this permeates into the culture where people sort of know they don't
mm-hmm,
you don't have to tell them like that the questions are unwelcome. They just sense it somehow.
mm-hmm.
How do you think that happens?
I I'm not sure. I probably it happens when somebody like you tries to ask a question and
Mm,
then your coworkers witness you just get attacked, you know?
mm,
At
yeah,
least in my experience, that's been the biggest deterrent. It's like I know this isn't going to be answered, and I know I'm going to be accused of being ignorant or ill-informed or just a bad person or a racist, something like that.
yes.
And I'm kind of like you, where I built up the courage to not care. I'm going to ask it anyway.
Mm.
But that took a long time, and
Yeah, no, it does. And
for the
even
people
even
around me,
then,
like,
it's not easy.
no, it's not easy. And for the people that are afraid to ask or they don't want to get involved in this at all, it's like I can't blame them really. You take a
And
risk, you gotta
do you have
use this
people
stuff.
come up to you after you've asked the question?
Yeah, yeah, I've gotten that a little bit. People will come up to me after the meeting in private and be like, "That was a good question," or "Thank you for doing that," or "We appreciate what you're doing." But
Yeah,
yeah,
this
not a
is
lot of public support.
yeah, and it's. Do you have any sort of ideas about how courage can be built up?
Hmm, that's a good question.
Mm. I
Um,
thought about this one. I don't have a good answer to it.
I don't know if I have a good answer to it either. Like, I think practice. If you're a fresh placement in a new committee, asking any question is scary. Like putting your hand up for the first time in one of those arts and science councils or whatever, that's scary. But the more you do it, the less scary it becomes. And so maybe don't start with your most pressing, potentially offensive questions. Just build up the courage through practice. But I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think this is why we need what's called scaffolding in the institutions.
What's
So
that?
historically, there used to be mechanisms put in place that were part of the institutional structure
Mm-hmm.
that facilitated. And Mark Mercer, who's the president or was the president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, used to talk about sort of what's called the disputational process. It used to be the peer review type of process, but the idea, the devil's advocate, I think it's actually the Vatican, right? Isn't it the Vatican that when they're going to be having a pope or something they're going to be selecting, they've got a position called the devil's advocate?
I have no idea.
Paul would know this probably, but I believe it is the Catholics that had this devil's advocate position. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it was when someone would be made a no, it's not a pope, I think it's a saint. So
Okay.
they're thinking about making someone a saint, and they want to make sure that they're making the right choice. So they get this position called the devil's advocate,
Mm-hmm.
which is a position that takes the position of what they consider to be the devil, which is the one that would be kind of asking the hard questions and trying to um, ask questions which would delegitimize the choice or throw the hardest questions and so on at
Mm-hmm.
the candidate. Um, and in the legal profession, we do this a bit. So we have you can't just have someone, even if you don't have a lawyer, they're not going to allow you to just go in there and have be prosecuted. You've got to have some kind of legal defense that is going to be putting forward your case against the prosecutor. So this kind of disputational, um, adversarial, kind of an adversarial type of approach in
Mm-hmm.
various development of policy. But we have the opposite of that now. As to what
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
that because everyone is afraid to stick their neck out, you don't have you rarely have someone who, even if they think it is got problems, this situation, that they're going to be reluctant to ask a question. So if we could recognize the problem, that problem, then we might be able to develop some mechanisms to assist in having a variety of different kinds of lenses that could be looked at this particular issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how to do that, but recognizing the problem, it's people sort of have to recognize it's not beneficial just to have this kind of hive mind or group think type of,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is what is a lot of these things, and especially in these whole the EDI stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you see that happen.
I think it depends what you want, what your priority is. Like if you just want your idea to win, then sure, let's go without devil's advocates. But if you want to move forward and figure out what the best course of action is, what the best idea is, then absolutely you need the devil's advocate because they're going to poke holes at your theory and at your ideas and they're going to force you to reevaluate things.
Yes,
I think that's how improvement is created. I think that's been done in academia since academia's been around, right?
yes. So final area,
Mm-hmm.
February 1st situation, the University of Lethbridge.
Mm-hmm.
So give me your impression as to what happened there.
Okay, so I heard the news that you were coming to the university, and I thought, this is interesting. I haven't seen a lot of controversial speakers, if I can say that, invited to the school. And of course, it's Paul doing it. And so I was excited. I was going to come see you speak, listen to what you had to say about wokeism, and I was excited for that. Then I saw all of the petitions and the Instagram accounts, and people were very upset about it. The university, they released their statement. First, they said, you get to stay, right? They're not going to revoke the what was it, the room reservation. So I
Mm.
thought that surprised me. I didn't expect that from the university, given the decisions they've been making recently. But then the petitions gained more signatures, and there was more outrage and more emails. And then they flipped their position, and they decided you're actually not allowed to come, and that made me. I was so upset. I was so upset. I was like, this is a joke. Like, why do we call ourselves university anymore if we're not going to allow people with challenging or controversial ideas onto campus? And yeah, I was very upset. And then I was present for the protests too. I think I got out of a lab kind of once they'd already started. So I walked through the U-Haul hallway and saw the however many people there was there. And it just disturbed me. I think
Mm.
that's the best way that I can describe it. It just felt like this is bad. Like I I don't know. It to me it seemed like that many people they were protesting against their own rights. You know, like today it's you, but tomorrow when they have an unsavory opinion that they want to present publicly, the precedent's been set that if the crowd disagrees with you, we can shut you down. And
Yeah.
yeah, it bothered me. It bothered me a lot. I
Yes.
thought it was strange.
Well, yeah. And so you, Paul Viminitz, and I are going to be pursuing this through
Mm-hmm.
the court system. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think this is going to be an effective way of of approaching this?
If we win, I think it'll be a little win in the grand scheme of things, but I also believe that the little wins will add up eventually. Um, yeah, I don't know how immediate the impact will be. I don't even know when our case is expected to be resolved by
Well,
2025.
yeah. So that's when it's going to be begin. So I think we have something earlier, which is in the sliding. Like this is if you go through legal processes, you'll find out
Mm-hmm.
there's this there's these constant kinds of skirmishes. I guess they're called skirmishes, where
Mm-hmm.
both sides are kind of fighting for their case, and they're trying to, sort of map out the terrain in which the battleground in which it's going to occur.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is whether Paul can be included
Yeah.
in the case or not because of Paul's grievance
Mm-hmm.
with his union. So the union, after a lot of work was done to get the union to file this grievance, because some argue that they're kind of pushing for the same thing as the court case is, that
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a repetition, but that's not true because the union's not making any charter arguments. So it
Mm-hmm.
should be, I don't see why Paul shouldn't be able to pursue his charter rights through the court case as opposed to that. And then the actual hearing of the case is going to happen in 2025.
Okay. I'll be
But we've
graduated.
already,
Yeah.
but we've already gotten a significant victory with the document, what I call the document dump.
Mm-hmm.
So if people haven't seen the document dump, should check it out because that's got like I didn't. There's tons of stuff in there that I sort of knew things were happening behind the scenes, but I had
Mm-hmm.
no idea the administration's response to this whole thing. Like
Yeah.
they spent the whole weekend like with I don't know how many emails. There's so many people that were involved. I was very shocked about the whole
Mm-hmm.
thing. And Martha, that's when I first heard about Martha,
Mm-hmm.
is the provost of EDI. And so the provost, the actual provost. So like the provost is an academic position. So
Mm-hmm.
to have all these other provosts, this is just a watering down of the
Yeah.
academic character. But anyway, provost, EDI, provost, actual provost, and president, they had these, you know, email exchanges, and then all these other administrators. So if we didn't do the charter challenge, we wouldn't have gotten a lot of that documentation. So
Mm-hmm.
it's already like been massive, you know, uh, increasing of understanding of the situation than what existed before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad we got that stuff too. It was very interesting. And so if any of the viewers have an hour to spare and they want to read through 200 pages of PDFs, they should check it out.
Yeah, and you don't have to look at the whole thing. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of it's quite repetitious. I haven't done the systematic. I was gonna when I saw it. I actually was looking at it today. I started writing down all the administrators who were involved.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then it's like you'd be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you a bit of a sense of the way universities are run these days, which is like, big, huge kind of bloat of administrators who are there to protect the brand of the
Mm-hmm.
University of Lethbridge. So, in your view, what is the University of Lethbridge's brand?
I don't even know. I don't think they're that differentiated from any other university in Canada at the moment. Like, I'm not sure what there is about it that makes them stand out. I think they have a good biology program and a good neuroscience program, and they're known for both of those. It's a smaller school, so that's one of their selling points as well, is that you can form relationships with your professors. That's one of the things that I really enjoyed about this school.
Mm.
But besides that, I don't know. They just seem to be following in the footsteps of the larger universities in the province.
And so, is that why you chose University of Lethbridge? Because of you were interested in neuroscience, and you thought it had a good program comparatively to other universities?
One of the reasons. Yeah, I knew I wanted to study neuroscience, but the neuroscience programs at U of C and U of A, they were ridiculously competitive. I think when I was applying, it was 98 average and 40 people accepted a year. I might be wrong about that, but I didn't meet the requirements for U of A or U of C. I smoked too much weed during high school. So I got accepted to U of L and I came, and I'm glad I did, honestly. I like it here.
Yeah, no, I find it's about the right size. Like it's a pity that they've been the wokeism has intruded so much. And I think
Hmm.
it's going to be. I think Paul Viminitz, did a lot to kind of keep it at bay, so that didn't completely take over. And now I'm very
Hmm.
afraid. I'm very afraid for the
Hmm.
institution now that he's
There,
no.
there are a few more professors that are kind of out on our side about this issue, but none as vocal as Paul. Like, I think Paul got a kick out of playing with fire.
Yeah, well, he as well was you know moving towards retirement,
Yep.
and was like, this is kind of the tragedy, is that that kind of cohort of professors who were properly trained, were academics, understood what an academic university was about. They're
Hmm.
all going to be retiring. And in my case, I was like the generation before and already somewhat contaminated, like by the whole like politicization of the university that was going on.
Hmm.
Yeah. Do you know how many students are at the University of Lethbridge?
I think it's about 7 or 8 thousand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good size, because you
Hmm.
get much more than that. And how big is the neuroscience program?
I have no idea. No idea. Sorry. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe 600 students in it.
Okay,
But
that's quite large, really.
my guess might be terribly wrong. I
Okay.
do think it's a pretty big program. I think out of
Yeah.
the science programs that they offer, neuroscience is the largest or is one of top three.
Oh yeah.
Hmm.
Interesting. Um, yeah. So students at the University of Lethbridge.
Hmm.
So what's your sense of how they feel about everything that's going on here?
I think the most vocal ones are kind of in opposition of what we are fighting for. But
Mm,
I this might just be hopeful thinking, but I do believe that the majority of students are on side with us. They recognize the ridiculousness of what's going on. They're tired of being protected and infantilized by administration. They
mm,
think that the social constructionist claims are ridiculous. But they're just whatever. I'm just trying to get through my degree. I'm just trying to graduate, get a job. I don't want to do anything that's going to affect my the opportunities that I might receive in the future. And like
yeah.
I think that is a legitimate risk that you take when you stand up for these things publicly. Like I wonder that all the time. Like, am I making a mistake by doing what I'm doing?
Yeah. Well, it's not, one doesn't never knows, what's going to happen. One
It's
hopes that things can be turned around. Like that's always
mm-hmm,
what I thought for many years. I thought that we were, there was certainly a developing authoritarian character to everything, but that if you could just organize well enough, if you could just get enough people, you could sort of have a critical mass that could have an effect on the organization. So
mm-hmm.
who's the president now of the students union?
It's this lady Malika Thomas.
Okay. And what's
Mm-hmm.
her background?
She was born in Jamaica. I believe she's from the Cayman Islands actually,
Oh yeah.
and she came here. I don't know what she's studying. I think it's sociology, and I know she wants to write her LSAT and get into law school.
Okay. And then the previous president,
Mm-hmm.
who was that?
That was Care Bat.
So anyway, figures quite large. She looms quite large in the document dump.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a sense of her? And as far as I can tell, she was one of the ringleaders of the opposition to the talk.
Yeah, especially from the student side.
You
Yes.
know, and I don't know which is the dog and which is the tail of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to tell. There's a whole bunch of people that are involved. But anyway, what did you have very much interactions with her?
Yeah, I interacted with Caribbean quite a bit. We disagreed about things, but we got along. We could be cordial with each other. But yeah, I saw the presentation that she put forward to administration, kind of
Mhm.
trying to get you canceled. And that was never voted on by the students union. Like I don't believe that was ever brought to GA. That was never something that we said, yes, we want to move forward with this. But the student union logo was stamped on every page of that document. So that was just something that I thought was interesting.
And is
Because
that can the was do you think that that was an executive decision?
yeah, I assume either from Caravi alone, but most likely it came from the executives.
And is that something that they have the power to do?
It appears so. They did it. So
Yeah,
yes.
but did them do like they uh like whether that is I don't know how decisions are made in the students union. Like whether I assume there it's kind of like executive power. You don't have to go to the body every time you want to do something. I don't quite know what the parameters
Mm-hmm.
are of that, but some you're given a certain amount of discretion in
Yes.
terms of the things that you want to pursue. But that seems to me to be a pretty large, like that seems to be a quite a significant action
Mm-hmm.
that was
And it
taken.
seemed like she was making that statement on behalf of the students union. But there were certainly people like me who wouldn't have agreed with that.
Yeah,
No say. So I'm not sure how much discretion the executives get, but
yeah,
certainly not every time they submit a document with the students union logo stamped on it. Like, they don't get that approved by the GA. So
interesting. Yeah, no, students. This is one area that I'm quite interested in is the role that students associations are playing in. I guess it would be called the corporatization of the university. So that's something that's been happening, increasing in prominence over the
mm-hmm.
last 30 years. When I was in university as an undergraduate, there were student unions, but
Mm-hmm.
they didn't have the same institutional type of role. Like they I don't know, I don't think they had voting rights, for example, on any governance
Mm-hmm.
bodies or anything like that. They certainly weren't paid positions.
Mm-hmm.
And at Mount Royal, I know the executives members are very well paid. I don't know if that's the same. Like I believe they get 40, they earn $40,000 around that each person.
I think it is similar. It's around there at Lethbridge.
Like that's amazing that you would be a student politician and you would be earning $40,000.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to me to be. Uh, I was very shocked when I heard that about the MRU case, but I wasn't sure whether their MRU case was similar or different from other university
Mm-hmm.
student unions and other universities.
I think it's the same, but it's a full-time job for these people. Like they're in the office every day from 9 to 5 or whatever.
Yeah,
They put in a ton of hours, and they can't take a full load of courses. Like there's no way that they could put in those hours and still take 5 classes. So I believe the executives are limited to two.
two classes.
Yeah.
Uh,
I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think they shouldn't be compensated, or should they?
no.
No, they shouldn't be compensated.
Well,
So,
they at the most you should get some kind of honoraria. Like
mhm.
I think that entrenching that has got problems for governance because the students are not like students' concerns should be listened to,
Mhm.
but that was happening historically. Like if you were a student and you went to your student union, you would they might help you navigate something, and but now it's this like big block that you're dealing with, and what happens is that it makes the student interest or the student kind of dynamic. It makes professors much makes it much more difficult to deal with students on a personal basis. So,
Mhm.
and I don't know, like I am sympathetic to the view that there are a number of professors historically who abuse their power. Yeah, like, this is always a problem that existed, but now, professors are afraid of students. Like they're afraid of complaints and they're afraid of having all these difficulties, and they
Mm-hmm.
want to kind of cater to the students so the students will not make their life a misery. Like this is kind of ongoing, and the Students Association, I think, they kind of add to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think governance now is becoming, like students are not experts, and that's why they're students, is because they're there to learn about disciplines and so on, and to
Mm-hmm.
kind of have this kind of catered to so much, I think, is part of the problem that we're facing. Anyway, I'm getting into my segment here, Jonah, but it is the hour point has been reached. So
Okay.
I'll just turn it over to you, and you can ask me questions like that and whatever else you fancy.
Awesome. Earlier, you asked me, what is my take on our case? What do I think the impact will be if we win or if we lose? What do you think?
I think it is going to have more consequence in terms of the discussion that it's going to generate. So
Mm-hmm.
I find personally that legal and bureaucratic processes are not very effective for dealing with these problems, because there's a cultural, and I think Paul has said this as well, and I agree with him about this, is that we have serious cultural problems at the university. And
Mm-hmm.
that is especially professors who think that certain ideas should not be discussed at the university. And we saw
Mm-hmm.
that there's about 10 professors who have made it not publicly known. Some have made it publicly known. So Carolyn Hodes is one person who's made it publicly known. Um, but there was about 10 in that document dump
Mm-hmm.
who were basically arguing that I shouldn't be allowed to speak because it would cause harm. And even
Mm-hmm.
someone like, I'm not sure if you know who Yale Belanger is, but I know Yale, and I actually invited him to speak at Mount Royal, and I think it was 2009. And, we disagreed in
Mm-hmm.
2009, but I would never have imagined that he would be a person who would be taking seriously this harm argument, that
Mm-hmm.
academic freedom was all well and fine unless you caused quote unquote harm, in which case
Mm-hmm.
freedom shouldn't apply. And he seems to be taking that argument seriously. So
Mm-hmm.
when you have that kind of relatively large contingent of professors who are making these arguments, then we shouldn't be surprised that we're having all these you know difficulties in being able to discuss these controversial matters. And this is going to get worse. This is getting worse as we speak. And for people who are listening to this, we have almost lost our universities now. Like I'm not even sure if they're over. Like they're very, very close to just being totally just not academic institutions anymore. So we
Mm-hmm.
really need, like, we don't have any more time to just kind of think, oh, wait and see if it blows over, because it's not going to blow over. It is going to have to be fought in a serious way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of the difficulty with the legal and the bureaucratic, because it assumes that if you just change a process here and a process there, that now you can rectify things, when if you don't have the culture that supports this kind of disputational mindset, this kind of openness where you explore things, then
Mm-hmm.
these bureaucratic and legal things are not going to work very well. But the publicity that we're going to get from it, and the discussions and the writing about it, see, that's why I think writing articles, discussing, having these kinds of conversations that people then listen to. This is kind of gives us a kind of a focal point that can help us to move the culture more towards an academic culture and a disputational culture and a open inquiry type of culture, which really does
Mm-hmm.
not exist very much at all in universities now.
What do you think happened to that culture? Why do we no longer have the academic disputational culture on campuses? Why has it been replaced by what we see now?
Um, this is a big question, and it's one that I've been thinking about a lot. One of the biggest factors is what's called the corporatization of the university.
Mm-hmm.
So universities are based in Canada on the American model, which is different than the model that existed in the UK at Cambridge and Oxford. So there's the American universities, and then there's the Oxford and Cambridge, which, and also some universities in Israel uh, are based upon the UK type of model. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, and I was mentioning this at the University of Alberta. There's a great video which I'll post when I do your blurb here on the Norman Finkelstein case. So Norman Finkelstein was a professor at DePaul University in the United States who wrote a book called The Holocaust Industry.
Okay.
And he wrote a bunch of other books too, but The Holocaust Industry was the one that was got everyone all hot and bothered. Anyway, Finkelstein, who is Jewish himself, argued that the Holocaust was being used by various Jewish interests to pursue Israeli policy against the Palestinians and so on. So he was arguing that there's a group that's doing this. Anyway, this angered a number of very, very powerful people. And as a result of that, he was denied tenure at DePaul University, despite being a very prolific scholar and an excellent teacher. And if you ever listen to
Mm-hmm.
Finkelstein speak, you will be very impressed by his articulation of certain ideas. Anyway, this event was held in Chicago at the University of Chicago, I believe. And there was a professor whose name was Nev Gordon, who is from Ben Gurion University in Israel. And he said that Ben Gurion University, if Finkelstein had been a professor at Ben Gurion University, he would have been granted tenure
Hmm.
because the academic kind of character still held at Ben Gurion because of the fact it was in the UK model and not the American model. And the UK model, the faculty elect the academic administrators.
Mm-hmm.
So you elect the provost and you elect the deans at in Ben Gurion, whereas in the American model, the chair is the only position that is elected, and the chair has to be, I believe, in most universities, has to be approved by the administration. So what
Mm-hmm.
happens is because you have no faculty control over the administration, it's all brought in a top-down process. There's no real accountability to the faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows for the administration to really kind of control everything that happens. And universities, according to Gordon, which I think he's put forward the most clear presentation on the subject that I've seen, said that universities are now a business that sell products. They're not something that is there to develop knowledge and educate students and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
so products, that raises the interesting question is what are these products that are being sold? The first one, most obvious one, is degrees are being sold to students.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that means that you want to sell as many degrees as you can. So, how are you going to do that? Well, you can't have things be too hard.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're not going to be able to pass people through, and so you can sort of see how this is going to really corrode the academic character of the institution. Professors are products; they're not just people who are producers and workers in the institution; they're products. So in my case, I was the product that I was couldn't be easily sold. Because
Mm-hmm.
I was, and Paul Viminitz, right? So let's talk about Paul, because we shouldn't be talking about my case, but Paul is now a liability for the University of Lethbridge because
Yes.
he's making people angry, and a whole bunch of students are, like they read his blog.
Mm-hmm.
No one knew about his blog until, February 1st. And then because they're all angry about everything that happened with me being invited, they decided to go investigate his blog. And this caused a lot of anger amongst many people, when you should really say, well, why would you care about that? Like, people can dislike it and so on, and they can argue against it. But because the University of Lethbridge thinks that this is damaging to its reputation, to have these kinds of ideas being put forward by one of their professors, they want to cut him loose, and then kind of get a new cohort of professors who are going to just spout the party line, which is consistent with the brand, whatever the brand is at the University of Lethbridge, which is an interesting question. I know certainly that one of the aspects of the brands of the University of Lethbridge, based upon the document dump, is was it Sacred Buffalo Stone?
Yeah, that's our indigenous name.
Yeah. So this is a big part of it. So if
Mm-hmm.
you're selling your Sacred Buffalo Stone brand, so if you're selling that, if someone's going to criticize, indigenous ways of knowing or territorial land acknowledgements, then this is not going to be consistent with the brand management that is going on.
It threatens your brand.
And so this is the sort of thing. So I think that's a big part of it as to what has happened. And casualization is a big factor of this. So casual, like over 50% of professors now are on short-term contracts, makes it difficult to have controversial opinions, because you want to you're insecure in your employment, and you don't want to say anything that's going to be upsetting and have a negative impact on you. And then, this whole cancel culture kind of mentality, which is not just in universities, it's throughout the entire society. People really, used to have a much more tolerance for views that we thought were immoral or offensive, and now there's a lot of pressure to not have those aired, to not have those views aired. So there's and that's the sort of the three ones that I kind of see coming up time and time again, but there's probably other factors.
When you talked about the culture in universities,
Yeah.
the issue that I keep thinking about is, as the universities become more left-leaning or woke or social constructionist, whatever you want to call it, they're more likely to only hire professors that share those viewpoints with them. And so then even if the university started at like 50-50, as soon as one side of the political spectrum takes the lead, it's hard to see how that doesn't just snowball all the way up to 98, 99, 100%.
Yeah.
I think
Unless
that's
you
what
have
we're
some
seeing.
kind of disputational structure that's built in. There's an organization, I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's called the Heterodox Academy.
Jonathan Haidt?
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt I think he's the founder of it. And he's been making this point for quite some time, which is about the viewpoint, what's called viewpoint diversity. So if you have a department and you have a range of views in this particular discipline, there should be a concerted effort to get representation from those different positions. And actually, that was the original meaning of diversity. So diversity started out, this was the Trojan horse, right? Is that it's what's called this Mott and Bailey strategy. I'm not sure if you've heard about this. I have mentioned it before, but this is something people should be aware of. And actually, James Lindsay really talks about this a lot too. And James Lindsay is someone who I'm a critic of James Lindsay, but I also think James Lindsay understands a lot of what's going on. Anyway, James Lindsay talks about this Mott and Bailey, which is a military term. It's a military strategy. So in military terms, the Mott and the Bailey is the Mott is the castle, the fortress, which is the defensive posture, which is dark and dank, and no one wants to spend a lot of time there. But you go there when you're under attack. And the Bailey is the fertile valley that you want to capture, and everyone wants to go there and, make, sow crops and increase productivity and so on. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're attacked, you go back into the castle and into your dank, dark castle and fight it out there until you can get
Mm-hmm.
control, and then you move out. So this is what happens in postmodernism, which is the subjectivity over the objectivity being kind of asserted. One of the ways in which this is done is in word usage, is the Mott and Bailey technique, which is you have
Mm-hmm.
two definitions for a word, and you have the word, one definition is banal and everyone accepts it. And
Mm-hmm.
the other definition is interesting and very contentious.
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you put out the interesting and very contentious kind of part, and when everyone starts to question this, you revert back to the Mott, into the dark dank castle, which is the banal, kind of meaning that everyone accepts, and that's what's happened with diversity, is that the Mott is viewpoint diversity,
Mm-hmm.
which everyone can agree with, because it makes sense that you don't want to have a hive mind, you don't want to have groupthink, you want to kind of contest things, and the way you are able to do that is if in a department, as if you have different positions that people are articulating, and then you come together and you have, you kind of listen to these different sides, and then you come to a decision. So that
Mm-hmm.
was like sort of the Mott kind of idea of diversity. Anyway, that got switched into um, identity characteristics,
Yeah.
proportional representation of various identity characteristics. Yet
Mm-hmm.
everyone has to think the same way. Uh, so
Mm-hmm.
so now we have, we're worrying about whether we got, 7% Indigenous representation, but everyone has to accept that, Indigenous science is, you know, equally valid to quote unquote Western science, when
Mm-hmm.
this is a very dubious proposition. And if we had viewpoint diversity, we would at least have some, principled defenders of the scientific method who would say, hey, wait a minute here. What is this indigenous science anyway? And how can there be a science that's indigenous? Like, isn't science a universal method that all people use to be able to understand the world? And certainly you can have indigenous people who are scientists, but that doesn't make the
Mm-hmm.
science itself indigenous. You'd be able to have that kind of objection being raised, but because the emphasis is on the identity characteristics and the whole kind of what would be considered to be the woke position that drives that,
Mm-hmm.
um, we aren't able to contest anything.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that there's a refusal to differentiate between the Maw and the Bailey, when, as you put it. I remember an instance last year in GFC. They were passing new policy that required internal committees to have diverse representation. And somebody raised that question. They said, there's a difference between visible diversity, like diversity of identity characteristics, and viewpoint diversity. And so, which one is it that we're required to ensure when we strike up new committees now? And the meeting ended. They didn't really get an answer at that point. But then they came back the next meeting and they said, we decided we don't want to make a distinction between the two. We believe that diversity is all encompassing. And,
Yeah,
that causes confusion.
yeah, and it's based as, that sort of idea, like that not making a distinction is because I think there's a number of people who believe that different identities, because of their identities, have different
Mm-hmm.
viewpoints,
Yes.
which is not necessarily the case. And
And that seems racist to me too, to assume that the black colleague is going to have different opinions or ideas than me just because he's black. It's like,
yes,
not necessarily so. Isn't that making assumptions based on his skin color?
exactly. And
All of these terms have been redefined, though. So
yes, and when you have, black, what would be considered to be black conservative voices, like
mm-hmm,
Glenn Lowry or um, Clarence Thomas, or these sorts
mm-hmm,
of things, then they're not seen as being black anymore.
mm-hmm,
Like, this is something, and James Lindsay does talk about this. And I had an interesting example of this at Mount Royal University on the residential schools question as to whether
mm-hmm,
there had been positive, you know, there had been positive elements to them, or and so on. Anyway, a student started to complain that they had this professor who was getting them to write on both the positive and the negative aspects of the residential schools,
mm-hmm.
and uh, and was complaining, and some people at Mount Royal, I believe, thought it was me who was the professor, and so they started to agitate and encourage this professor, the student, to go after this professor, to mob this professor. Anyway, it turned out that the professor was Indigenous.
That's a tricky situation.
And I think what happened is it had snowballed so far that people couldn't really change course. But still, uh, they would, that wouldn't really. I still am kind of puzzled about this, because
Mm-hmm,
I can sort of understand at least the argument that you've got to listen to the person who's Indigenous because they're oppressed and they have this, this position in this oppressed dynamic, and who are you as a non-Indigenous person to be trying to tell them anything? And, like, okay, like, I disagree with that position myself, but I can sort
mm-hmm,
of see that view. But then to attack an Indigenous professor because they are arguing that there's positives and negatives, on what basis are they attacking that Indigenous professor? They're attacking them because they think the idea is, they don't
mm-hmm,
agree, but they're not. They've argued in other contexts that one can't just sort of universally judge an idea in terms of its validity based upon reason and evidence and logic.
mm-hmm,
So they're now attacking this idea that's held by an Indigenous person because they don't like this idea, but they don't seem to have any ability to evaluate as to whether this is a good idea or not, because how they were evaluating that before was in terms of whether the person holding the idea was Indigenous or non-Indigenous. So
mm-hmm.
it's like this totally, and I still don't know how they select out what they consider to be the good ideas if they're not going to use the ancestry or the identity of someone to do it. Like, how do they know whether that idea is the valid idea or not?
Mm-hmm.
They're
Yeah,
not going
at
to
least,
use it.
yeah, I would understand the argument if they said that your opinion on residential schools is invalid because you're a white female.
Yep.
But once they start telling Indigenous people that their opinion is invalid, then you're right. It raises the question. It's like, well, then which opinion is valid? Who
Yeah.
gets to decide, and where does that come from?
Yeah.
So,
So who knows what is, you know,
mm-hmm,
I don't, I find it also, and in the end, it's just the people who have power are just telling you this is the way it is. Like, and we don't have to explain anything to you. We are in charge and you are not, and end of story. Like, that's a
mm-hmm,
like, this is not, this isn't going to work in the long run if we do accept that we want an academic institution. If that's what,
mm-hmm,
if that's what we're supporting, this kind of way of going about it is not going to be helpful at all.
mm-hmm. I often wonder too how much of it is malicious. Because when you put it like that, it's, we're going to tell you what to believe and you're not going to question it. Like to me, that sounds malicious, but I have a hard time believing that all of the professors and all of the administrators in these positions are doing something bad and they're conscious of it. They're aware of it. So I wonder how much of this just comes from naivety, or that they have good intentions, but a different idea of how to get there. Like, do you think the people that push this movement the hardest have good intentions?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. So there's definitely true believers, You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like people who kill abortion doctors because they think abortion is murder. Like, okay, yeah, I've killed one person, but I've saved, 1,000 babies. So it's, and then that's their mentality. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's a principled stance. You disagree with the position, but it's not being done through ill intent. You're that kind of thing. I know a lot of um, professors who are legitimately concerned. They think this is really immoral to be
Mm-hmm.
arguing for open discussion on the residential schools. Like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's immoral, and I can respect that principle. Like I think that this is not really what an academic institution is about, but I understand that. But then we have the Machiavellians. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there are, and they're the ones who they're frightening. And I know at least I know a few, and I know one in particular who is just complete psychopath. Who
Mm-hmm.
is their career is enhanced, their power is enhanced by this wokeism stuff, because like this is like the great thing about wokeism, and I don't think people understand this about wokeism, is that wokeism uses compassion
Mm-hmm.
to assert authoritarian uh, types of processes on people. And what you're going to see is once we've destroyed all the protections, then you're going to really see the fascists move in and take over. And they've used the naive people as tools in this. So
Mm-hmm.
what's happened now is people will accept the authoritarian maneuver because they think it's for the greater good. So, what's the harm in territorial land acknowledgements, for example?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you don't agree with it, Indigenous people have been terribly oppressed historically, and it makes Indigenous people feel like they're included and so on. So, even though I think it's based upon dubious, kinds of scientific evidence, I'm just going to do it because I think it's going to be helpful to Indigenous people. And I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
support the imposition of it on other people, even people who are going, I don't agree with this, and I don't appreciate people pretending that somehow everyone's on board with this when, not everyone is. And if you want to go do your territorial land acknowledgement, go ahead. No one's stopping you. But why
Mm-hmm.
have this official thing going on where you're pretending everyone's involved in the whole thing? So, but they say I'm going to support this imposition because it'll be beneficial for Indigenous people. But by them supporting this authoritarian maneuver and this complete disregard for dissenting opinions, that is going to trash all the protections that we
Mm-hmm.
used to have for
Yeah.
dissenting positions. And then once you trash all those protections for dissenting opinions, you're now at totalitarian regime, and you're going to have the fascist takeover. And that, I think, that is the future. That's why I'm saying fight hard, fight now, fight hard. We're not,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have people being disappeared and being thrown in jail right now. That's not what's happening. You lose your job, and that's bad. No, I don't recommend that to anyone. But I'm still here, and I'm still alive and kicking, and I'm still here to fight another day. And
Mm-hmm.
until you put a gun to my head, and then maybe I'll, once you're going to lose your life, you have to, this is it's you don't have a lot of options. So that's another matter, and especially if I'm an atheist, so I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that this is all I have. This is my life.
Yeah.
But unless you're going to threaten me with, you know, coercion of, you know, jail and death and whatever, I will not give an inch to this, and I will fight. I will stand my ground and fight it out. And if we could just have enough people doing that, organized, then we could beat it back. But unfortunately, because we're not organized, every single person who takes this on is opening themselves up to, severe punishments, and
Hmm.
not very many people are gonna risk that.
Do you think that you would be willing to go to jail for these ideas? Or at that point in the coercion, would you just give up and say,
No, I
fine, have
think
it
I
your
think
way?
I think I'd go to jail. I'd go to jail, but death is another matter. Like
Yeah.
that is really serious.
Hmm.
But we don't like we're not even there yet. So if we're not at jail time, why aren't people organizing? Like this is a big question, and it's a hard one to and professors have never been very good at this anyway. Right? We're
Well,
individual, we're all kind of comfortable, in our positions, and we don't real you sort of political animals, unlike the activists who are
mhm,
serious. Like that's what they do. They spend all their time, mobilizing the
mhm.
troops, and doing all this and getting everyone to oppose things and so on.
Was
Um,
the question, since we're not at jail time, why are people organizing or why aren't they?
why aren't they?
Why are they are?
Why aren't they? Why, since we don't have jail time,
Yep.
uh, why aren't people organizing against this?
Yeah, not bad enough yet for the time being. You can still ignore it, right? You just watch your tongue, don't say the wrong thing, you won't lose your job. That only happens to evil people like Francis.
And it's sort of a bit of the frog in the water, like people are don't really realize how bad it is. Like that's why I think my case is so important, is because like we do have professors who have been fired,
Hmm.
who they've done some things which uh that I'll mention who the person is, just because if I don't, then everyone's going to be. There's a guy by the name of Rick Mehta who was
Okay.
fired from Acadia, and
Hmm.
he's now been put in jail for a week or something like that, because he was told not to contact people at Acadia, and he's been disobeying court orders, and people are somewhat afraid of him because he is
Hmm.
acting in a manner that is concerning about it. Anyway, the way he's been behaving, and I know his case quite well because I have had access to documents that other people don't have. Um, he's not a good poster boy for academic freedom. But
Hmm.
I am an incredibly good poster person for academic freedom because I support everyone's academic freedom. I'm not someone who says, "Oh, well, I support discussions about the residential schools and trans activism," but that Palestinian activism, that's gone too far. And if you start criticizing Israel in a manner which is, delegitimizing the Jewish state, this is genocide, and this is no, like,
Hmm.
unless you are inciting violence against people, or you're defamation and so on as well. Okay, but unless you're doing that, um, we should be able to discuss everything at a university. Like
So do you
even
think
things that are
that's,
really, pardon me?
sorry, do you think that's where the line is between what we should consider freedom of free expression and hate speech? Is
Yes,
defamation and
yes,
inciting violence?
yes. Well, hate speech is an invented Canadian thing.
Hmm.
It should not
Hmm.
exist. So that was a mistake. Hate speech.
Hmm.
We had protections for what we're talking about as being the problems, which are incitement. So
Hmm.
it was already illegal to incite. And you have to
Okay.
be very careful about that because,
Hmm.
Rwanda, you had someone on the radio talking about a ethnic group as a bunch of cockroaches and so on, right? The
Hmm.
Holocaust comes to mind as well, of the vermin, references to
Hmm.
vermin, and when you start talking like that about things, and you're encouraging people to go and exterminate groups of people, um, that is not now. Finkelstein, I was listening to a really good thing, and this is an interesting question because he was the one who approached this the most honestly that I've
Hmm.
seen, and he's talking to this audience, and it was just after the October 7th stuff is going on. So he's been in the news a lot because he's a Palestinian supporter, and he's very very principled about things. And he's at the Ontario Public Library or Toronto Public Library in a discussion about this. And he says to people, academic freedom, it's one, decisions should be made about professors' work by their colleagues, not about businessmen, not by politicians and so on. So any kind of decisions about your competence or anything should be made by other academics. That's the first aspect of academic freedom. The
Okay.
second aspect, according to him, is that when you're as a professor, you've got certain obligations, and like you can't go into a math class and start teaching about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so on. Like you've got obligations. But when
Mm-hmm.
you are a private citizen on your Facebook page and so on, you should be free to say whatever you want, and your employer should not punish you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the second principle. Who agrees with that here? And everyone puts up their hands. Pretty much
Mm-hmm.
agree. It's okay. Well, that works well in theory, but it's not very practical. For
Mm-hmm.
example, let's say you have a professor who is on their Facebook page who says, I wish that Israel would kill all the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
Should you be able to say that? And then no one agrees. Like 10 people agree with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would be one of those 10 people who would agree with that. And say you should be able to do that as because you're not inciting there. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're saying that's a wish that you have. And it's a very pernicious and a horrible wish. But it's not going saying, hey, people, let's go out there and let's kill a bunch of Palestinians. It's just expressing your, you know, your desire. And I'm not, I think that's a horrible thing for anyone to wish for.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not, as far as I'm concerned. But that would probably be hate. It would be in Canada, be bordering on it. So that's for me. I don't think anyone should be prevented on their private, thing from saying these kind of
Mm-hmm.
contentious and horrible things. Like it's just you just socially you would ostracize that person, so
Mm-hmm.
you would
What
not be.
about what about in a place like a school? Because I've been thinking about what happened to you, and I figure there must be a line where the person that a professor invites to the university, it's just unacceptable. The university can't have it. I'm like, where would that line be? Because I think somebody challenged you, Paul, and I at the library. It was like, would you be in support of a Holocaust denier? And it's like, yeah, if it's to listen to them and then challenge their ideas and it's in that type of setting, then sure. But it's like, what if a professor invited a clown and they tried to book a room just for a clown to honk his horn for 8 hours a day, every day for a month? If the university says, no, we can't have that, was that clown's rights? Were that clown's rights violated in the same way that we believe ours were? What do you think?
Well, I don't know about the well, if it's expression, I guess so. I don't see anything wrong with that. Like book a clown, maybe it's performance art of some kind, or but like
Mm-hmm.
the university, and this is the loophole that's in the Chicago principles, has a right to regulate the use of space and so on, because if you have the clown thing being booked every day in a room,
Mm-hmm.
that means that other, you know, things are not going to be able to be booked there, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like you just limit it because you have other ideas and everything that you need to give people access to and so on. So, and it's like the people who use the heckler's veto is that's not freedom of expression, because you are stopping other people from speaking. So you get to speak, but in order for other people to speak, you need to be silent a little bit so that other people can speak.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of thing that's being talked about in the Chicago principles, kind of regulation of space. So I don't think that there should be any restrictions on professors bringing in whomever they want to bring in. And, you have things like Flat Earth Society and that's not, it's not a legitimate position. But if a professor has decided that, they could be bringing them in for um, to kind of get at the logic behind the flat Earth, kind of
Hmm.
arguments. So it just because you have an idea that you're discussing in a university, that doesn't give that idea legitimacy.
I
And people
agree.
often confuse that, is that
Hmm.
you are saying it's an idea. This idea does exist. The more contentious example was actually at the University of Lethbridge in, I don't know what year, but a philosophy graduate student, it was like 2018 or 2019, gave a
Hmm.
talk, and I still cannot believe that this talk was not, didn't have the same kind of reaction, in defense of pedophilia. Did you hear about that?
Was that a student of Paul's?
Uh, I don't know. I know it was a philosophy student, but I don't
Hmm.
know. I assume it was. I assume that it probably was, but I don't know. Anyway, this went ahead and this talk happened. Uh,
Uh-huh.
so and people are now. That's probably would not be able to happen. I would think. I don't know.
I don't know. I feel like it depends who's doing it. Because if that came from somebody like Paul, they'd be like, that's reprehensible. That's in the same boat as your defense of rape or your defense of terrorism. We're not allowing that.
Yeah,
But if that came from a queer theorist, I think the school would give it the go ahead.
yeah. Um, and this student, according to Pam Lindsay,
Hmm.
wasn't doing it because they supported pedophilia. They were doing it to bust taboos and make the point that all ideas are on the table at the
Hmm.
university. And I think as well. I'm not sure who was mentioning this to me, but in trying to understand why pedophiles are pedophiles and how to deal with pedophilia as a problem, it
Hmm.
might be helpful for social workers and members to kind of understand why these pedophiles have the kind of these kinds of things are doing the things that they're doing. Like there could be a number of reasons why you might want to look at an idea that would not be actually supporting that idea. It's in terms of trying to understand that idea more than you
Hmm.
were able to in the past. And this is and but I think that people, and I've heard this many times, is that there's some kind of legitimacy that's given to an idea if it's discussed in a university. Well, that's
Hmm.
kind of looking at things from a position of authority, listening to authority, and so on, rather than the critical thinking, evidence based types of ways we should look at things. Is that we
Hmm.
shouldn't accept things just because a university says it. Like, and universities shouldn't be saying these things anyway. This is my other big
The university
opponent
itself
contention.
shouldn't take a position. The
Yeah,
position
like
should only be taken by professors within the university.
yes. So, but now we're seeing this all the time, which interestingly now is finally being criticized because of the Israel Palestinian situation. All these um, people saying that the university should take a position on Israel, or support Israel, or condemn Hamas, or like,
Hmm.
and the universities were reluctant to kind of get into this for obvious reasons, but that was good that they didn't get involved, but they were so hypocritical because they've been getting involved in so many things on so many occasions otherwise, that
Hmm.
it doesn't really pass the smell test, that they just decided all of a sudden that they didn't want to be making political statements on behalf of the university. So they
Hmm.
shouldn't be talking about Israel Palestine. They shouldn't be talking about Black Lives Matter movement, that is. They shouldn't be talking about indigenization, and like, let the professors make the arguments, let the students have their discussions, but like, stop this administration, kind of control over the discussions that they are trying to assert.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I think all of these things they need to be discussed. It's like
Yeah,
what is the line between speech that is legal and illegal? You know, what are we going to allow people to express on the university campus? What would we do in the case of somebody tries to book a clown into a room every day for months? Those are like I don't know the answers to those things, and I think it's for us as a group to decide, but we can't decide those things if we're not having those conversations.
yeah. And I think that space restrictions, that's kind of understood, but any content or anything,
Mm-hmm.
you can't restrict it, because then you're you're taking a position on it. Like if we had, we have often things booked repeatedly that, you know people don't like, and all these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
It really is kind of a position, taking a position against a particular argument, or a particular performance, or a particular form of expression, and so on, when really it should be up to professors and students to decide that they want to bring someone in. And I don't I really think that if we enter into the making decisions on the basis of the proper way to conduct ourselves and so on, then it's just going to be those that have the most power are going to be able to make that determination.
Mm-hmm.
There was a report done in the 60s called the Calvin Report, which is the best document on this subject. That was the University of Chicago, is the university known for being the most academically oriented on its policies.
Mm-hmm.
And there's what's called the University of Chicago trifecta. And
Okay.
the first one is the Chicago Principles, which is about freedom of expression and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing should be that's found to be offensive and harmful should be prevented from being expressed, and it's up for individuals to decide. That's what are supposed to happen in universities in Alberta, but it's undermined at every turn by wokeism. Then we have the Calvin Report, which is that universities should not be taking political positions on matters. And the example at the time was the Vietnam War. So a bunch of people wanted universities to take a position on the Vietnam War, and the University of Chicago said, no, we don't take political positions, because that's giving a signal about the right way to think about something, when it should really be the community of scholars and intellectuals coming together, that through discussion and debate, it's whatever comes out of that. It's not going to be a decree. And then the third is merit-based hiring.
Yeah, I agree with all three of those.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I
that's
think
what
they're all under threat as well.
they all are under threat. And as we saw from the Chicago Principles directive by the government, you can't just have them imposed, because you have them
No.
thwarted at every turn by the people who are not on board with the principles. And so we have
Mm-hmm.
to kind of take a step back and then revisit the principles, convince people about the principles, which we're not doing, because
Mm-hmm.
the people who are academically minded, have been so intimidated that they don't really want to get into it, and they just
Mm-hmm.
don't see. And some people have given up.
Yeah.
Paul has given up, and like
Mm-hmm.
I'm completely outraged at Paul's firing, and there should just be a huge uproar about it.
Mm-hmm.
But, Paul is just saying no. But that doesn't mean that we can't take forward the fight on his behalf. But it would
Mm-hmm.
be easier if he was a bit more outraged about the
Mm-hmm.
situation. Yeah. So those are all under threat, and it's gonna be a big battle.
Mm-hmm. That was interesting when you were talking about the fact that the government, they told schools to take up the Chicago principles, but like you said, they've been undermined every possible turn. I was going to ask you, do you think that politics is downstream of culture, or do you think culture is downstream of politics? Which one do you think leads the other?
So,
Or do you think that that's putting it too simply?
well, I guess we'd have to have an understanding of what culture and politics are first, I guess. So, politics is sort of disagreements about the public distribution of values and resources.
Hmm.
So, like, not every conflict is a political conflict, because a
Yes.
political conflict is about uh, things that are binding on the society, things that are going to be made public.
Hmm.
So, uh, like the development of legislation would be the best example, the most obvious example of sort of something that's definitely political, right?
Hmm.
Any kind of time you have a law or a policy that's developed that's going to be applicable to the society, whereas two friends having an argument about where to go and have dinner or something, that's not a political argument. But distribution of resources, public resources and values, that is.
Hmm.
Culture is very wide, is a very broad concept, which the definition that I know best is Leslie White's, which is the culture is the ability to symbol.
It's the
So
ability to symbol.
yeah, so symbolic. So it's learned behavior and abstraction. So any kind of sort of learned behavior where you have some kind of abstract kind of interaction about something. So, art, which is an abstract kind of idea that you have and that's accepted, and various practices and so on. So
Hmm.
generally in discussions, culture is distinguished from instinct.
Okay.
So learned behavior versus things which are genetically determined. So
Hmm.
so that's kind of the general kind of thing that we're getting at. So does legislate what role do public decisions play in the general learned behavior of societies?
Hmm.
Um,
Because
and
it seems like the government, they tried to solve the issue that they saw on university campuses through the enactment of legislation, but the culture wasn't ready for it. And so it didn't work.
yeah, and sometimes you can have, like, the civil rights movement is a good example of this, where you had serious opposition to equality, legal equality for Black people in the southern United States.
Hmm.
So you had the Civil Rights Act that was developed that forced it. People resisted and so on. You saw armed guards, bringing children into school, like these sorts of things. The question, I guess, is did that move more quickly because of the legislation than it would have if they hadn't had legislation?
Hmm.
Like, it might have actually slowed things down because it created more opposition and backlash and so on. I don't know the answer to that question.
Hmm.
Some would argue that you just need to have the legislation as just a moral statement, like to you need to have principled moral statements being made, and even if people resist it, that doesn't matter, because you, as a public body, have decided this is a moral position. But if your
Hmm.
population doesn't agree with it, uh, you
That
know,
doesn't seem very democratic then.
this is these are so I don't think I've kind of just sort of mapped out the terrain for discussion here. I'm not sure
Hmm.
but there is a relationship, but
Hmm.
it's a bit of a chicken and egg question. What came
Hmm.
first, the culture or the politics? I would argue that the culture, because, like, where does the politics come? The culture is a more general kind of thing. So it's kind of the practices that people have. Out of those practices comes various forms of political interaction, and then the political interaction then results in public decisions, which then feeds back on the culture. So it's
Hmm.
kind of a back and forth process, but I don't see where the politics would come from, except from some kind of cultural kind of basis of the various, sort of forms of learned behavior and
Hmm.
practices and so on that a population had.
I think somebody could argue that it's politics that leads that. Politicians lead the culture. The culture goes where the politicians direct them.
But how did the politicians become leaders? Like, where did they get their the nourishment that enabled them to become leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could argue, and this is kind of the great man theory of history, that you have
Mm-hmm.
exceptional individuals that just are born, right? And they just have this charismatic character that they just kind of, it's almost innate. They have some almost
Mm-hmm.
kind of innate political sensibility. Um, and I think that's an unlikely explanation because you have very, very charismatic individuals. Like, I guess Che Guevara is the best example of this.
Mm-hmm.
You know the story of Che Guevara?
I know who he is, but his story, no. So tell me.
So Che Guevara was Fidel Castro's main uh, friend, and they were very much a pair, and there might have been other people involved, but they were the most well known figures in the Cuban Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And Castro was very close to Che Guevara, and they had this idea about how to bring about a socialist society, and they brought it in Cuba. And Cuba had very, very particular characteristics that allowed the charisma of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara to be successful. And one of them was it was an island, small island. So
Mm-hmm.
they could defend it. Like you could defend it much more easily than other places. So Che got really high and mighty about all this and decided to bring the revolution. I believe it was Bolivia. I went into Bolivia and was just killed almost immediately.
Hmm.
So same person, same kind of revolutionary ideas, same charisma, but the circumstances in Bolivia were very much different than the circumstances in Cuba. So, you know, the great man, we're going to be sexist about it, the great man is successful in certain conditions, cultural conditions, and is not successful in other cultural conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So,
That's interesting.
anyway, Jonah, on that note,
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was nice to
I
speak to you.
think we've had some very interesting ideas that we haven't come to a lot of conclusions, but we have sort of explored some of the terrain. That
Mm-hmm.
is there anything else that you would like to say that you don't think you had an opportunity to say uh, in this discussion?
No, I didn't come into this with anything that I wanted to say in mind. I'll have a conversation with you and see where it takes us. So,
Anyway, I wanted to thank you very much for agreeing to be on the Rational Space Disputations.
yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I hope I can still find a job in the future.
You too.